In this video, I'll show you how I created this slice of the forest floor inside a glass box. For this build, I'm using this glass tank which I made myself from picture frame glass. It's got a hinged glass door and it'll work perfectly for the idea that I've got in mind. To start off, I need to make a drainage layer at the base of the tank. I've got some fine leaker which will be perfect for this. It's extremely lightweight and its small size makes it ideal for a nanoscape like this one. If you can't get hold of this, don't worry, as aquarium gravel or even rocks from outside still work just fine. For my UK viewers, I have got some of this available on my website, so feel free to check it out. Now that a suitable amount is in, I'm using my hand to spread it out and try and make it nice and flat so there's no high or low points. This is only a small terrarium, so the drainage layer really doesn't need to be too deep. This here is some window screen mesh and it'll act as a substrate barrier that will stop the substrate from getting down into the leaker. I'm placing the tank on top and then using a sharp blade to cut it out around the outside. Make sure you use something like a cutting mat if you don't want to damage the surface underneath. I'm not too worried about this old desk. I can now take the substrate barrier and place it inside the terrarium, and as you can see, it's got a nice snug fit. Next up is the terrarium substrate. As you may have guessed, I'm using my usual mix and I'll put all the components in the description below. If you don't feel like making your own substrate mix, don't worry, as most ready-made mixes still work really well. I'm pouring in a generous amount and then using my hand to gently compress it down into place. As I'm sure you can tell, I'm also sloping up the substrate towards the back, as this will help create some nice depth inside the terrarium. Now let's move on to the hardscape, as I've got a pretty cool idea for this build. I want to use this piece of cork bark to look like a fallen tree on the forest floor. In nature, fallen trees provide an abundance of nutrients and life for surrounding plants and microfauna. I want to try and recreate that in this ecosystem. The branch isn't long enough, so I'm using a small piece to create the illusion that it's one continuous trunk. Although it's extremely simple, I'm really liking how it's looking so far. I have got a couple more steps to complete before I can start the planting. I'm adding a bit more substrate around the trunk to make it look as if it's been there a while and to give it a bit more stability. To add to the hardscape, I'm going to place in some black lava rock. These pieces have got some really nice detail and I think they'll be a good contrast to the cork bark trunk. I got these rocks from my local fish shop, but if you don't want to spend any money, you can simply use some rocks or stones that you found outside. I always recommend experimenting with multiple different placements before settling on your final design. In this case, it didn't take me too long to come up with a layout that I like. I do want this rock on the left to sit a bit higher, so I'm adding some more substrate. I'll likely add some more details later on, but I'm happy with the hardscape so far. Now it's time for some plants. I want some taller plants to go in the back behind the rocks to help fill out the background. I think this unique species of Java fern would do this job really well. It has these frayed ends which you don't really see too often. I'm placing in some sphagnum moss and then going ahead and placing the fern on top. I'm making sure not to plant it into the moss or substrate, as it's an epiphyte and it'll likely rot if its rhizome is covered. This is the case with most aquatic ferns used in terrariums like this one. Now it's time for the moss. I've got a couple different species that I'll use together to help create a natural looking ecosystem. This one here is cushion moss. It's a slow growing species and I'll mainly use it for the foreground. The second one is fern moss. It's a lot more wild looking and faster growing. Both these species are perfect for beginners. To prepare the cushion moss, I'm tearing it up into small pieces and then using some scissors to trim off the base. Don't throw away the cutoff, as you can use it as a replacement for sphagnum moss or even use it to grow fresh new moss. By cutting the moss down, it allows it to sit much closer to the substrate and results in a better looking terrarium. I'm gently pressing it down onto the substrate, as this will help it wick up moisture and keep it growing healthy and strong. At this stage, it's just a case of filling out the foreground with the small patches of moss, almost like pieces of a puzzle. Whilst I plant this moss, I'm excited to announce that I'm releasing a weekly newsletter called Wednesday Updates. I'll update you on one of my ecosystems every week to show you how they're growing and evolving. I'll give you tips and tricks as well as a behind the scenes first look at upcoming projects. Don't worry, I won't be spamming you like some other newsletters, and it's just one weekly email. It's completely free, so don't miss out on the exclusive content. Also, feel free to reply to the emails with pictures of your builds, as I'd love to see them. There will be a link in the description and the pinned comment. I'm excited to see you there, but for now let's get straight back into building this terrarium. Now that the moss is in, this mini ecosystem is really starting to take shape. To stop the moss and plants from drying out, I'm giving the tank a good spray down. I feel like this gap here is a bit too open, so I'm going to place in another black lava rock. I think that's looking much better, so let's start getting some more plants in. I've got a couple cuttings of this Fittonia. I think this variety is going to look much more natural in this setup rather than the vibrant pink that you usually see. These cuttings don't have any roots, so all I'm doing is planting the stem through the moss into the substrate and they'll root themselves in no time. The next plant to go in is some Ficus quercifolia. This is a small-leafed climbing plant that is perfect for nanoscapes like this one. I'm planting it in places where it can climb and spread around the scape to add some nice detail. Next up, I've got a small cutting of this stunning begonia. It has these beautiful iridescent leaves. I'll also plant a few cuttings of Pelea glauca. This is an easy to get hold of beginner plant that is perfect for small setups. Same as the Fittonia, I'm planting the stem into the moss and it'll root itself in no time. With the planting complete, I'm adding a few small rocks for detail as well as some spiderwood branches. Adding small twigs like these is a really easy and effective way of greatly improving the detail and interest of any scape. I'm making sure to place them in to follow the natural direction and flow of the corkbark trunk. It's looking good, but there's still some key steps that need to be taken. These here are springtails, and as many of you know, they play a key role in keeping the ecosystem clean and healthy. They're even more important in this terrarium as I used a good amount of wood which is always prone to growing mould. They'll eat the mould and poop it out in the form of nutrients that the moss and plants can use to grow. You can still make a successful terrarium without them, but believe me, they do help out a lot. Now all this terrarium needs is a good spray down with water. I really love how this terrarium's turned out, and I definitely think I achieved the vision that I had for this build. I think the variety in plants really adds to the natural look, and I love the detail that the small spiderwood branches bring to the scape. Sometimes I wish I can shrink down and explore this mini world from a whole different perspective. I'd love to hear what you think of this build in the comments below, and maybe even things you might have done differently or would have changed. And don't forget to check out my newsletter, as I'll definitely be posting an update on this terrarium in a couple months' time. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful.